Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Sunday, April 23rd. April 23rd. I got my dates mixed up a little bit there. It's a beautiful day here in Dallas, an absolutely beautiful day of spring. And today we'll be chatting with our good friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. We got a lot of foreign policy to get into tonight. In fact, elections in France. We'll start with that. We've got North Korea. We've got, of course, a situation with Russia and those bombers getting a little bit too close to other American planes. I mean, it's a pretty dangerous world out there, and I think that we can finally come to terms with the reality that Mr. Trump, whatever you may think of Mr. Trump, he was left a real mess by Mr. Obama, and I think we're seeing that more and more every single day. I've got a few thoughts on Bill O'Reilly, too. I want to talk a little bit about that. I think there's a certain double standard here. You know, I'm not defending, of course, what Bill O'Reilly did or didn't do or the allegations, but I feel there's a certain double standard. I'm getting very worried about any accusation of sexual harassment because it's become so politicized. You don't know what to believe anymore, especially when the allegations are printed in the New York Times. Colleges and free speech. I think this is becoming a bigger problem in the country, and more people are being forced to come to terms with the fact that there's something very bad going on in our colleges with respect to free speech, particularly free speech for conservative speakers. One of the most amazing things that I've heard in quite some time, I heard today from the DNC chairman, Tom Perez, who basically said there's no room in the Democrat Party for a pro-life candidate. Now, I understand he dialed it back a little bit. I think he took it back a little bit, but it really shows you just how to the left this party has gone. And I don't think a remark like this is going to help them at all. For example, in some Hispanic communities, we remember what happened to Wendy Davis here in Texas in 2014. One of the big reasons why she went down as bad as she did was her position on abortion. So this is a tough position for the Democrat Party to take if they want to maintain strong support from Hispanics when it comes to the elections. We'll talk a little bit about the Clintons. Bill had a very interesting article about the Clintons today. And then, of course, they had elections down in Georgia where the Republicans won, but you would have thought this was the biggest election in the history of mankind. Well, it really wasn't. You had one Democrat running against 11 Republicans. Let's see what happens in June when there's a runoff. So a lot to get into today with our friend Bill. Let's say hello to Bill Katz. How are you, Bill?
Oh, just fine today, Silvio. Watching, of course, as everybody in this business is, the French elections. Why is it we are so fascinated with the French elections? It's because France is such an important country in the Western Alliance, and their political system seems to be really in a state of almost semi-revolution.
That's it. And I understand the results. I don't have all the numbers, but I understand that two of the Mrs. Le Pen and somebody else will be going to a second round, right?
Excuse me. Yes. Yes, there'll be another round in 2 weeks. The rule is that the top two candidates, unless one gets 50%, and they never do, will go to a runoff. I believe the runoff is in early May. It will be Marine Le Pen, who is the daughter of a very far-right politician in France who formed this movement that Marine Le Pen has now inherited, and a gentleman named Macron, who is new to politics, a rather young guy. Naturally, there'll be the inevitable comparisons to Kennedy and others, who is outside the establishment. Did not come from the political establishment. This is something that is quite remarkable, to have two candidates competing for the presidency in France, neither of whom is an accepted member of the establishment. And there is this feeling of shake-up, as there was in the Brexit vote in Great Britain and the election of President Trump in the United States. So we have, in a way, a continuation. I suspect that in the end, the more traditional views of Macron will prevail, and that he will become the next president of France. But still, one cannot ignore the numbers, and one cannot ignore the evolution in France and the emergence of people who are not part of the usual gang.
Right. No, it's a fascinating situation happening in France now. Just before the show, I was talking to one of our sons, and we were talking about the election in France because he was getting some results on the internet. And I mentioned to him that France has, as I see it, three basic problems that they're not being addressed in this election, or at least I haven't heard it. Number one, of course, is the immigration problem. That's being addressed by Le Pen. She's obviously talking about that and nationalism and national identity. She's doing that, so let's give her credit. But the other two problems are the welfare state, which is really unsustainable, and the lack of babies, as we've discussed before. So you don't have any babies, you have a very generous welfare state, and anybody can come in. That doesn't sound to me like a recipe for tranquility, Bill. On the contrary, it sounds like a recipe for the kind of chaos that we've seen in France and other countries in quite some time, Bill.
That's correct. France is not in good shape. France is, I know an expert on France who always likes to say France is different. They like to go their own way. We remember that for years when de Gaulle was alive and was the president of France. France would not participate in NATO exercises. It was, I think, technically a member, but we were not permitted to station troops in France. And he almost came out as something of a bit of an anti-American, which might be odd because America was one of the countries that liberated France in World War II. But France is different, and we'll have to see what goes on now. Now, if Macron is elected as expected, there will be no attempt, at least immediately, to withdraw from Europe because he is a devotee of the European Union. If Mrs. Le Pen emerges, which would be a shock, there will be an attempt to withdraw from Europe, and the UE may actually collapse. So in a way, it's exciting times, dangerous to a degree, but exciting. But again, right. I think I think what you are seeing throughout Europe, throughout North America, in certain parts of Latin America, a feeling on the part of people that they have been left behind, that their views are ignored, and they are asserting themselves. Whether they assert themselves wisely or not is something for history to decide. But I thought it was interesting also in connection with this subject that a new Washington Post poll, which has been brandished all over the Internet today, demonstrates that, yes, President Trump's opinion numbers or approval numbers are somewhat low for a new president, but that he would still defeat Hillary Clinton not only in the electoral vote, but in the popular vote. And that is stunning, because we get all this propaganda from the liberal press that he's terrible, that nobody likes him, that he's going down to defeat. And here we find a poll result published by a liberal newspaper showing that he is what was it now? Was it 2 point? I think it was 3 points ahead of Hillary Clinton should the election have been held today. And that kind of negates the Democratic Party argument that his election was a fluke. It was not a fluke. His numbers are low, and I think that if she were president right now, her numbers would be low because of the bitterness and the division in the country. People compare it to past presidents like Obama, who had, a 69% approval rating at this time, and his administration. That was a goodwill number. He was our first black president. People wanted him to do well. But you can't really compare that situation to the highly divisive situation that we have in the country today. Trump is actually doing, I think, reasonably well, given that situation. And I think this number today that came out of Trump versus Clinton is stunning.
Right. Well, the other thing, too, about that poll is that I just saw this about an hour ago, a discussion of that poll, and something like 94% of Trump supporters are still with him. Yes. Which means that the energy's still there. I would also argue that comparing President Trump's popularity, let's say, to President Obama or to President Bush in 2001, I remember President Obama being treated quite well by the media and even Republicans. I know that some Republicans said some nasty things and so on. But at the end of the day, I thought Republicans, I don't remember any significant Republican running around saying that he was not legitimate or something like that, as you're seeing with President Trump and definitely with President Bush back in 2001. But one thing I'll say about President Trump, he's decisive. He is obviously committed to whatever he's committed to. And I think at the end of the day, it's the old story about the strong horse, that people follow the strong horse.
Yes.
And I think that's what's going to happen eventually. People are going to say, I don't like this guy, or I may not agree with him on everything, but he's a strong horse. And we need a strong horse at a time like this, Bill.
We do. And I think that his moves in foreign policy have proved to be decisive and rather popular. The strike in Syria, the strike in Afghanistan with the super bunker buster bomb, the confrontation with North Korea, where he has held his ground. And I think that one of the things that has to occur now with the Trump administration is he has to be consistent. He can't go out there and make threats and draw red lines and then do what Obama did, which was to let people trample all over the red lines. And that, of course, is a great fear that the Washington establishment will get to him and say, well, you don't really mean this, do you? He has to say what he means, and he has to mean what he says. And there may be some risks involved in this, but I think the world is getting the impression of a decisive leader who wants to lead and who will be true to his word in the end. I find it very interesting, the sheer number of foreign leaders who have come to Washington recently to meet with him. You don't have to come to Washington when a new president takes office. You can always say you're busy, or you're going to the park, or you had a dental appointment or something. But to see the parade that we're seeing, the president of Egypt was here, King Abdullah of Jordan was here, of course. We've had the president of China, the prime minister of Japan. This is all in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks. This is quite extraordinary, and they want to meet with Donald Trump. As world leaders, they're not going to be swayed by newspaper articles that Trump is a fool or an aberration or a clown. He is not. And I think that this parade of leaders, if not a vote of confidence, is certainly a vote that America is important again in foreign policy.
Absolutely. And I think that's very clear. You can just feel it, that there's a lot more respect in around the world for the president. They may not love him, I'll say that. They loved Obama, but they didn't really respect him, I don't think. But I do think they respect President Trump. But I mentioned in the introduction, Bill, what a terrible world President Trump has inherited. Presidents always inherit something, but I don't recall anything this bad in a long time, Bill.
That's exactly right. It's a world in turmoil. It's not a bipolar world. The world we grew up in was, to a certain degree, a bipolar world. It was the United States leading its allies on one side, and the Soviet Union leading its allies on the other side. China, once it broke from the Soviet Union, was a third force, but still we saw the world as bipolar. The world today is multipolar, with crises occurring in all different areas, and crises that don't seem to be managed easily by the leading powers. You have North Korea, and we really wonder how much influence does China really have over North Korea. It might have some influence, but when a country like North Korea has nuclear weapons, which it does, and is developing long-range missiles, which it has a certain power of its own. In the Middle East, you have the rise of Iran as a mischief maker, and you have a civil war in Syria that, due in part to Mr. Obama's directionless policies, seems to be intractable. And when people look at that and they see, well, here's one crisis, here's another crisis. Afghanistan is erupting again, as we see. The combat is fierce. The Taliban is back as a major fighting force, again, thanks to President Obama's ridiculous policies, and policies that I think led us down a primrose path. And I think there is a feeling of tremendous instability, and also a feeling that any one of these crises can erupt into a much larger conflict.
Right. Well, certainly North Korea.
Yes.
Because that is one bullet away, one missile away from a gigantic mess. But even Russia, Russia seems to be pushing its weight around a little bit. Assad in Syria seems to be he wants to demonstrate that he's in charge. Now, a lot of that could be for domestic reasons, because he may not want to look weak to some of the other groups internally. But it just seems, I don't remember, I remember, of course, Reagan, from Carter to Reagan, there was a lot of concern about the world. But Reagan took care of that real quickly, I thought. But that was a much more manageable situation than this one. This is truly, it's like everywhere you look, there's a potential fire, and in some cases, some real fires. And I don't see any easy options for any of it, Bill. I don't see any easy options in Syria and North Korea. To some extent, let's take Syria as an example. What would you do there? What side would you intervene on? It seems like there's bad guys everywhere now, Bill.
I think that we learned a lesson that we should have already have learned from the pre-World War II period, is that when these situations start to develop, they have to be nipped in the bud. They have to be stopped early, or else they will spin out of control. We had plenty of warning in Syria as to what was happening, but Mr. Obama drew a red line. He then let the red line be tramped upon, and then kind of washed his hands of the whole thing. And I think that's where we went very wrong there. The way we went wrong in Korea, and it has now become a pattern because it was under really mostly Democratic administrations, is that we had the same negotiating team that negotiated with Korea, negotiate with Iran, and their attitude was almost that of Neville Chamberlain. As long as you get a piece of paper, you have won in some way, some kind of an agreement. We have an agreement. We have somebody's name on a document. The trouble is that the North Koreans just kept developing these nuclear weapons, kept developing their missiles, and violated these agreements. And we kind of, I wouldn't say ignored it. Ignored isn't exactly the right word. We allowed them too much leeway. We would apply some sanctions. We would make some speeches. We would say tut-tut at the UN. But in the end, it is very hard to stop countries from developing things unless you make it very clear there will be physical consequences. And there were no physical consequences to North Korea, and it has now reached the point where they are so strong militarily in certain areas that physical consequences will be extremely difficult without causing enormous casualties. Now, the same thing is true of Iran. The Iran nuclear deal, as President Trump has said, is a terrible agreement. It basically guarantees that they will have an atomic bomb, which is not exactly a noble objective. And in the interim, they are developing missiles that were not included in that treaty. So what do we have? We have a country that at the end of a certain number of years will be permitted to develop nuclear weapons, and they will have the intercontinental missiles all ready. Probably with the holes drilled for the mounting of the nuclear weapon. And that is no way to conduct a foreign policy. Now the question is, what?
Let me take a little break. Yeah, let me take a little break, Bill. But before I go on break, I just wanted to say that we'll come back to it after the break. But when you see the way that North Korea, how things have changed once North Korea was able to get a nuclear weapon, it really makes me happy we took out Saddam Hussein, because now we know for sure he doesn't have one, and that.
Yes.
In retrospect, was quite an achievement, I think, when you see what's happening in North Korea. We're going to take a little break, and we'll come back for another segment with our good friend Bill Katz, the editor of Virgin's Agenda. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas. Welcome back to our second segment with our friend Bill Katz, the editor of Virgin's Agenda. We were just talking about North Korea. We were talking about Iraq, Bill, and I think the point I was trying to make is that in the case of Iraq, we acted, whether he had them or didn't have them, it doesn't matter. We know now that he doesn't have them. And I think that whole region, can you imagine that whole region if Saddam Hussein also had a nuclear weapon or a chemical whatever? It would have been a lot worse than it is right now. So in that sense, I continued to congratulate President Bush. It was tough, I understand, and mistakes were made, but I think the objective was met, which is to get to make sure he didn't have those weapons, Bill.
Yes, and I think that one of the things we really have to learn about this whole series of episodes in the Mideast is that simply because somebody signs a piece of paper saying they're going to do something doesn't mean they're going to do it, and doesn't mean they're going to do it fully. We also had an agreement with Syria that they would get rid of all their chemical weapons. And we now know that that is simply not the case, that they have a considerable store of these weapons. I would not be shocked if we learned eventually that Iran is conducting nuclear research in some secret location. It wouldn't be shocking at all. Nor would I be shocked if we eventually find out that Saddam Hussein did have weapons of mass destruction and very possibly moved them to Syria before the war. You know, we remember back to 2003 when we went into Iraq that there were credible reports from quality journalists that there were trains heading into Syria, or convoys, not necessarily trains, but convoys heading into Syria before the Iraq War. And we don't know what was in those convoys, but there was speculation, informed speculation, that it could have been the weapons of mass destruction that President Bush was after. And now we find that Syria has all these chemical weapons. I cannot prove it. I don't have any proof, but I certainly have my suspicions that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction may have in fact been moved into Syria, or at least some of them. And it would not be shocking to me if we eventually found stockpiles. But this business of signing agreements with people where they pledge to do something, and then we later find, oh, I guess they didn't do it. Well, that's too late, you know?
That's right. No, exactly. And these people, it seems to me, you know, you're exactly right. It seems like they want to make a deal at any cost. And that's right. When you know, I'll give Donald Trump credit for this. Donald Trump always said you got to be willing to walk away from a deal.
That's right.
As President Reagan did in '86 with Gorbachev. You got to be willing to say, hey, I'm walking away. I'm not going to do this. And obviously with President Obama's, whether it was the Iran deal or the Cuba deal or the Clinton deal with North Korea back in '94. It seems like they really wanted to make the deal, and I think you communicate that to the people on the other side. Well, they're not going to be as tough to negotiate with, because they know you want to negotiate with them at any cost. So I agree. I think that we have got to get very tough with these countries, and I know that a war with North Korea would be very, very bloody, but I'm beginning to wonder whether there's really any alternative. It seems to me that at some point we may have to do it. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Pentagon right now was looking at some options. I'm not a military expert. I don't have any inside information. But I'm simply saying my gut feeling tells me that we're looking at options where we could minimize maybe the casualties, but we deal them such a blow initially. We punch them so hard at the onset that we diminish some of their ability to fire some of that artillery, Bill. Again, it's just speculation on my part, but if I was the President of the United States, I would ask my military people to draft and look at such a plan, Bill.
Yes, and, you know, it may very well start as follows. The North Koreans, in order to have nuclear missiles, or rather intercontinental missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads, have to test these missiles. And I've seen some speculation in some good journals that the next time they do this, and if they fire a missile out over the Sea of Japan, that one of our ships might very well shoot down that missile. Now, that would be a hostile act, but a hostile act directed against a very, very serious threat. And the question is, what would the North Koreans do then? Would they attack one of our ships? Would they attempt to launch another missile, perhaps in the other direction? Would they simply cease and desist for a time? I don't know. And that's the point. Nobody knows. You mentioned last week on the program that the city of Seoul, South Korea, is ringed with artillery pieces across the border in North Korea that, if they were all fired at the same time, could produce devastating casualties in South Korea's capital of Seoul. And that is one of the things they have to be afraid of. Could we take out those pieces quickly? I don't know. Again, these are the unknowables. And what we are talking about in the case of North Korea is something that is sometimes called the rationality of irrationality. They act irrationally, and people who act irrationally are frightening because you never know exactly what they're going to do, and you never know how far they can go. They can go to an extreme. They can even use a nuclear weapon, and that is what makes this so frightening.
Right. No, I know. It's just absolutely crazy because there are no pretty options. There's no pretty ending to the story, one way or the other. There's absolutely no pretty option. Let's come to the United States, back to American domestic policy for a second, Bill. And I just wanted to say a couple of things about Bill O'Reilly. As you know, he's not at Fox News anymore now. In the interest of full disclosure, I liked O'Reilly a lot. I thought his show was very good. But what really bothers me about O'Reilly, I'm not defending what he did or didn't do. Honestly, I don't know what he did because it's all been allegations and newspaper articles, and it has never been proven by a court of law. But what bothers me more than anything else, Bill, is what I perceive to be a double standard. That, we bring down O'Reilly, we have to bring him down for allegations of sexual misconduct. But others don't get that treatment, Bill. And it really makes me wonder. Roger Simon, who writes at PJ Media, had a very interesting piece during the week. He was saying, he was asking the question if this actually has more to do with the fact that, Bill O'Reilly is perceived to be a very strong supporter of President Trump. Whether it is or it isn't, I just don't think people should be hounded like that. I just find that these these coordinations of advertisers and stuff like that, I just don't think that's good for the country. The listeners or the viewers should be the ones who decide whether he goes off the air or not, Bill. So that's my 2 cents. I'm sure Bill O'Reilly will do well. He's got plenty of money, so I don't think he has to worry about that. But it's just, I have to say that the way CNN and MSNBC went after him, you really have to wonder how much of this is sexual harassment and how much of this is politics, Bill.
You do, and also let's not forget the 900-pound gorilla in the room, which is the management of Fox News and of the News Corporation, which owns Fox News. This is Rupert Murdoch's company, but he is aging, and his sons are taking over. And his sons may not have the point of view that he has. He has been very supportive of people like Bill O'Reilly, but one of his sons, James Murdoch, is known not to be. He's known to be a liberal, and he may, the speculation is that he may now try to completely revamp Fox News as a liberal, or at least as a centrist news network, which would devastate the whole idea, the whole premise behind Fox News was that it was an alternative. But from what I have read, and again, I can only report on what I've read, James Murdoch is very social and is very, very sensitive to his position in certain parts of society. And the parts of society that he is sensitive to are the liberal parts, the respectable establishment, that he wants to be a member of the respectable establishment, and that he doesn't want to be burdened by the reputation of Fox News as a conservative outlet, and that he's making changes in accordance with that idea. These changes will basically destroy Fox News if they're carried out. They will lose their audience, and they will just become somebody else. And maybe that's exactly what he wants. Maybe he said, at least they won't be offensive to my friends. And what you then have to ask, and was asked this morning, I think there was another article on Pajamas Media, on PJ Media, asking why conservatives don't pay more attention to building up cultural outlets. They complain constantly and should about the school system and about the control by the left of universities and do absolutely nothing about it. They complain constantly about the press and about the bias in the press and do absolutely nothing about it. Well, Fox News came along under Rupert Murdoch's direction and did do something about it, and now that one outlet is threatened. What will the conservatives do? Will they just sit around and mope again, or will they get together and form a new Fox News? And I think that's an important question.
It is, and we'll see what happens because one of the things I think they're going to find out. I mean, this is not politically oriented, what I'm going to say right now, but one of the things that they're going to find out is how difficult it is to do what Bill O'Reilly did, which is to be number one for 20 years and to maintain a program for 20 years every night, 60 minutes, keep it interesting. A lot of people didn't like him. I understand that, but the show was interesting. I didn't always agree with him either. I mean, there were many nights when I didn't agree with him. But
he was a terrific broadcaster. That term that term is not used too much anymore. But there were in the history of broadcasting people who were just terrific broadcasters, and they may not have been the most popular figure, and they may not have been the nicest people. I remember in the 1950s there was a man named Arthur Godfrey. Arthur Godfrey was all over CBS. He had Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts. He had Arthur Godfrey and his friends. He had a morning show 5 days a week. He wasn't a particularly nice man, and in fact, that's what brought him down eventually. That his obnoxious behavior and some other things, but he was a superb broadcaster. He knew how to use the medium, as did Bill O'Reilly. And one of the things about this, and you kind of implied it in some of the things you said, is that what is holding Bill O'Reilly back from being grabbed up by another network is the sexual harassment thing. It's nothing he did on the air. I mean, he's a conservative broadcaster. But this is a technique that is used now on the left all the time. Race, gender, and ethnicity. Go after somebody, and basically it's a new form of McCarthyism. Just imply that he's a bigot or a sexist or a racist, and that person is dead, no matter how good he is.
Right. Well, and they get a few advertisers excited. They call some advertisers, and the advertisers panic because they don't want to be seen as being racist either and that kind of stuff. I just don't like it. I prefer that these decisions were made by viewers and by listeners or viewers. And I always thought one of the kicks to me, one of the things I was laughing about here the last couple of days. You remember back in 98, 99 when we were told that all this personal misconduct should not be taken seriously because it had no impact on the job. The president, the unemployment rate was low, and the 401ks were doing well, so it wasn't affecting President Clinton. Well, you could say the same thing about O'Reilly. His ratings were never impacted by any of this. I mean, his ratings actually were very high to the very last show that he did. I just hope that Fox News understands, the management understands that it is very difficult to do what O'Reilly did. Rush Limbaugh does it on the radio every day. It is very difficult to put out a show like that every single day and succeed and keep it interesting, and television is probably even more difficult. So I just hope they understand how successful he was. And, hopefully the people who follow him are successful, but I don't know. They got some big challenges over at Fox News now that Bill O'Reilly is gone. I do want to jump, Bill, to another topic, and that is colleges and free speech, because this is now an issue with Ann Coulter and others, and there was a very interesting editorial. I think I sent you a copy in the New York Post saying that it may be time to change the management in some of these schools. I guess they're talking about the administration. When a school cannot guarantee the safety of a speaker, that school has a problem, Bill, and that has to be addressed. You can't just because I don't agree with somebody, it doesn't mean that person shouldn't speak, Bill.
That's exactly right, and I think that there are thoughtful liberals, which sometimes is a contradiction in terms, but there are thoughtful liberals who also are becoming very concerned about what's happening. Because they are true liberals, and not the phony liberals you get all over the place, they understand the danger to a democracy when people are shouted down in universities to the point where they can't speak. And this is happening all over, and many university administrations are just caving in. One of the reasons they're caving in is they're afraid. There is real fear in universities. Universities are very, very delicate places. They really have no self-defense mechanisms. And you can say, well, how about expelling students who engage in this kind of behavior? Well, yes, and they should be expelled. They really should be expelled. But when these students are members of groups that advertise themselves as marginalized, the universities are afraid that if they take decisive action, the situation will explode and get worse. And there is some logic to that, but if you don't take the action, the situation gets worse in another direction, and that is the end of democracy. I think also what you see in universities is very cowardly behavior on the part of faculties. I cannot believe that all of these universities have faculties that are so weak and so indifferent to democracy that they just allow this to go on because they kind of accept it. I suspect that many professors do not accept it, but they are afraid to speak out. And you often see a professor. Yes, and you also see. Well, I know that there's a famous professor who I can't mention, who has told me that he is very much on the right side of this, the correct side of this, that every time he makes a speech, he gets telephone calls from professors or emails saying, "Thank you for speaking out. You're saying what I can't say," and that what they are basically saying is they're intimidated, that they cannot say it because their incomes are involved, their families are involved, they have to live in these university environments where it can even affect the way their families are treated. The political left is vociferous, and it is in some cases even violent, and there are people who have legitimate fears. And they are not particularly brave people. You know, bravery is easy when you ask somebody else to do it.
Right. Well, what's interesting, too, is Senator Sanders made a statement, about Ann Coulter, saying that he was concerned that she wasn't being allowed to speak. And I think there may be another message there that Senator Sanders may be sending out, as well as, beyond the free speech. I think he may also realize that how out of control these left-wing groups are. When you burn down, when you behave the way we saw on television, some of these groups behave, that's a danger. It's the old story about Frankenstein. It comes back to kill his maker, or whatever the right word is. And I think that's what Senator Sanders is beginning to realize. I give him credit for defending Ann Coulter. I wish more people like him would stand up and say, hey, she has the right to speak, and if you don't agree with her, fine, don't buy her books or go to the speech and ask questions. That's fine. But I'm very concerned about the lack of free speech in our colleges, and more concerned even with the administrators, Bill. Let's move on to another topic, because this is one that I even had to double check this one, Bill, because I wasn't sure if it was true, where the DNC chairman, Tom Perez, has basically said that there's no room in the Democrat Party for a pro-life candidate. It's kind of what he said. He didn't exactly put it that way, but that's kind of what he said. Now, he did take it back a little bit later. I understand he took it back a little bit, but just the whole idea that a political party would say, half of the country, we're not interested in you. How can you become a majority party when you say to pro-life people, we're not going to even listen to you because we don't agree. It's just insane, Bill. It would be the same thing as if the Republicans would say something like, no pro-choice person can be in our party, Bill. It's That's crazy right. Both ways here.
It is, and we saw that, by the way, about a month ago in this so-called Women's March, which occurred in Washington and was given great fanfare. Women are marching in Washington. Well, it wasn't women who were marching. It was pro-choice left-wing women who were marching. The heads of that march made it very plain they did not welcome any pro-life voices. How can you call it a women's march when you're excluding, what percentage of American women are said to be, well, it depends on the poll, but like 40% are said to be pro-life? How can you just eliminate 40% of American women and then call it a women's march? But what they do is they get the cooperation of the media. An organization like CNN, which is now basically gone as a news operation, it's just become an anti-Trump, day in and day out operation, and they just call it a women's march, never defining who they mean. It reminds me of what happened during the Vietnam War, when we had, quote, anti-war demonstrations. And you would go to them, as I did. I was on the New York Times, but I went as a visitor. And they were pro-communist demonstrations. Some of them, not all. But some of them were openly pro-communist, and yet they had to be described as anti-war demonstrations. Because if you described them as communist, you were called a McCarthyite. But you're having the same thing now. You get a march of women who have made it plain they have no interest in the participation of pro-life women, and then it's called a women's march. It should be described more precisely. As far as Tom Perez goes, what people are learning is how extreme he is. He's was one of the most extreme members of the Obama administration. He's out on the far left, and really close to the fringes. His co-chairman in the Democratic Party, Keith Ellison, is even worse. He was a member of the Nation of Islam, for God's sake, and yet he was made co-chairman of the party. And you wonder, you look at a party like that, and you say, who is this for? Is it for a majority of people who are demanding this? The answer is no. It's for basically a fringe of American politics. The Democratic Party is going further and further to the left, and the sad fact is they have the media with them, and that is that, because what the media will do in a situation like this is it will simply eliminate certain things from its reports, and so you'll never actually know fully what these people believe. But there is going to be a presidential election in 3 years, in 2020. Within 2 years, you're going to have the formation of candidacies for that election, and it is quite possible that you'll have a Democratic Party that is under the control of what used to be called the lunatic fringe. Now, in between, there is a critical 2018 election, and I have to tell you, I'm not absolutely certain of where we're going in 2018. By tradition, the party in the White House loses votes in that first midterm election, loses members of Congress. That's what happened, by the way, with Clinton. He lost Congress. It's possible Trump can lose Congress. I mean, it would be an incredible thing if he lost the House. The Senate is very close, and if he lost the Senate, I would be, angry and frustrated. But if he lost the House, it would be devastating. It would be absolutely devastating, and it could happen. It could happen unless the Republicans, the Republicans in Congress must get together. And they've got to accomplish something. They have to go to the American people with a record.
That's right. No, they have to. Otherwise, they will be thrown out, because people, as you said, people are party, and I think people are very anti-party, and they're becoming more and more, I think, independent and a lot more concerned about getting the job done than necessarily calling themselves one party or the other. We're going to take a little break, and we'll be back with one more segment with our friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas, segment number 3 with our friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. Bill, you're exactly right. I mean, 2018 could be a big surprise, but every time you look at the problems in the GOP, and then you look at the problems over on the other side of the Democrats, you really don't know what to believe. I mean, we just saw this election in Georgia where the Democrats nominated somebody to run who doesn't even live in the district, Bill. Yeah, this is unbelievable. I mean, I'm sitting there saying, how can you even run? I mean, I'm surprised. If I had come in in third place in that election, I would be filing a lawsuit against this gentleman, whatever his name is, by saying he cannot legally run in this district. He shouldn't even be in a runoff bill.
Yes, and I agree with you. His name is Ossoff, and he is looked to as the new Barack Obama, or whatever, the new young light of the Democratic Party. I've looked into this chap, and I don't believe a word he says. He's one of these people who is running in in the South, in a district that has traditionally been Republican, and his game is that he says he can work across the aisle, that he respects these people, he understands them. But when you look at his history, he's a traditional liberal lefty Democrat. He worked for an African-American congressman in Georgia in foreign policy issues, a congressman with a rather poor record of respect for other groups. He does not seem to have in his background any great wisdom. He's a young kid. He's only 30 years old, and the money that he has raised has been raised almost entirely out of state. He could win, by the way. He could win, and it would be a big boost to the Democratic Party if he did. But the idea that, and this is going to be the game, it's the Claire McCaskill game. Claire McCaskill is a Democratic senator from Missouri, and she runs as a moderate, as do Democrats from states like Missouri. And then when she gets to Washington, she goes right into the liberal pattern, and then the next time she's up for re-election, she comes back as a moderate. And this is a game that the Republicans have to learn to counter. But it's going to be tried a lot in a number of states next year, and they could take over the Senate. Now, my great fear is if they do take it over the Senate, there goes President Trump's chance to make more Supreme Court appointments, because you have to have a majority in the Senate. And I think that the Republicans are just not fighting hard enough. That election is going to be upon us before we know it.
That's right. Well, I just hope they get their act together. I have confidence that I think they will do something on repeal, because I think that repeal of Obamacare is one of the things they ran on, and I think they've got to do a few other things. But you're right, they have to get their act together, or they're going to lose. I mean, what I was trying to say before we went on the break was that I don't think the country is as Democrat or as Republican, or I should say a big chunk of the country is more concerned with results. And I think they'll throw the Republicans out if they don't feel that results are happening, and then just like they threw the Democrats out. And I just think it's more of a results type of thing, which is a lot of the reasons that Donald Trump, I think, was elected. I think he ran as a Republican, but I think a lot of Donald Trump's appeal was the fact that he would appeal to independents, people who are not necessarily Republicans. One big problem, Bill, and you wrote about this today and the last couple of days, one big problem that the Democrats have is the Clintons, who a lot of Democrats wish they would go away, but they just hang around. They just hang around. I mean, it seems like they believe they should be eternal, Bill. They should live forever in the party. They don't seem to understand retirement, Bill.
Yes, I know. Retirement in Washington is something nobody looks forward to, because once you're out, the phone stops ringing, and you suddenly realize you have no friends. I've always thought that was really the basis of Washington politics, that people want those jobs because they have a lot of pseudo friends all of a sudden. But both parties have very substantial problems. But one of the things that we must always emphasize in discussing politics is a fundamental of a democracy, and that is people do not get their information about politics directly. Nobody calls them on the phone from Washington and says this is what's happening. They get it through the media, and where the media is at any given point will play a dramatic role in what happens politically, and that is something I am really concerned about. We talk about the importance of a free press to the preservation of a democracy, and it is important, but if a free press can preserve a democracy, a free press can also destroy a democracy. And I think we are reaching a tipping point with the press, what might be called the academic journalistic complex, sort of like the industrial military complex, that really does have this country in a lock grip. And it worries me.
That's right.
It worries me that they can shape the opinion. This is what Hitler said. Give me the minds of youth, and the minds of youth are now in the hands of the political left. So we could talk about political parties all day long, but if people come into the voting booth having been trained in a left-wing high school and a left-wing college, and reading left-wing newspapers and watching CNN, all the work that a party does can go down the drain.
That's right. No, you're exactly right. Well, looking at next week, Bill, there's a lot of stuff going on, certainly going back to foreign policy. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's even talk now that there's going to be some kind of a tax package that will come out Wednesday. Exactly what that is, I don't know. There's talk of health care. It seems like at least the Republicans are getting the message that they got to do something, Bill.
Yes, and they also are getting the message, I hope, that they've got to do something for the people who vote for them. Trump has a base, and I know some of the criticisms of the original health care package was that that base would have been badly impacted by the Republicans' own proposals. You take care of your people first. Trump has to prove that the people who voted for him were right, that he will serve them. And he has to do that. The easiest place to do that is taxation, because he can cut their taxes or propose that their taxes be cut. And that has to come first. He has got to demonstrate. I mean, the tax system can be used politically, and it should be. And the proposals he makes this week have to be specific enough to assure people that he's on their side. It cannot just be some vague proposal or some philosophical proposal. Yes, we have to cut the corporate income tax, and that's an important thing, but the personal income taxes of people who are out there voting must be cut, and must be cut enough to make a difference in their lives.
Right. Well, you also have to explain to people that you cut the corporate income tax because that's how they get jobs. In other words, it's not for the benefit of nameless corporations. It's for the benefit for their benefit, because they're going to get jobs when these corporations grow. And then of course on the foreign policy side of this, Bill, I mean, we're living at a time where on a day's notice there could be a foreign policy crisis that could throw us right into a war. That's why it's so frightening, Bill.
It is. Lincoln used to say that he didn't move history. History moved him. And that is true, I think, of every president, especially in foreign policy. There are things that come up that you never expect, that you never ran on. President Roosevelt in 1940 ran on the notion that he would keep America out of World War II unless attacked. He always added that. Well, we were attacked, and we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. And then the Germans did us the favor of declaring war on us, so that the president didn't have to go to the American people and describe and explain why we were fighting Nazi Germany as well. Things can happen that will come out of the blue. I mean, when 9/11 occurred, nobody in the Bush administration expected we would have an attack like that in President Bush's first year in office, but it shaped his administration. So we'll have to see. We have these threats that we talked about earlier in the program, and they are unlikely to go away. So yes, things can happen, and again, we stress the importance of news coverage and the picture in the heads of the American people.
And is it time, Bill, for the media to drop this idiotic 100-day measurement? I just think it's the silliest thing in the world. Trump's first 100 days, and I understand the history going back to FDR, but it just seems to me that it's an absolutely worthless measurement. And you mentioned President Bush. In the first 100 days of President Bush, whatever he did, that was not his presidency, because his presidency was defined by 9/11 and terrorism. So I just wish they would drop this 100-day. It means nothing, Bill. It means absolutely nothing to me, and I suspect the most Americans do, Bill.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. The 100-day thing, as you said, goes back to Roosevelt. We were facing an economic catastrophe when he came to office. He did take a great deal of action in the first 100 days, but it is a false measurement, and it is a measurement that if you applied it, for example, to President Kennedy should have been out of office after 100 days, because his first 100 days included the Bay of Pigs. It included really stumbling all over the place, and it took him a good year to get into the presidency and to get things done. President Reagan, people forget it took a long time before his policies started to take hold. His approval numbers in the second year of his presidency were nothing to write home about, but he is now regarded as one of the most important presidents in American history. And need we talk about Harry Truman? I mean, who left office with an approval rating of something like 26% and is also now regarded as one of the most important presidents. The 100-day thing is silly, but we have a 24-hour news cycle that is turning out to be a curse in journalism, because they have to fill this time with something, and you get organizations like CNN that have decided to fill it with anti-Trump rhetoric. So
that's right.
A lot of silliness going on.
That's exactly right. Well, Bill, as always, thank you for your time. Have a great week. Keep up the great work at Urgent Agenda. We always check it every day. And we look forward to a lot more analysis from Urgent Agenda next week. Thank you so much for the great work that you do and for the time that you give us on Sundays.
Well, thank you, Silvio. Looking forward to next week.
All right. Good night. Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. Well, that's going to do it, folks. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you later. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas.